we need to do now, of course, is shape the leading and trailing edge, just like we did on the wing. The leading edge is going to be a little bit easier because our piece of balsa more closely matched the exact width of the aileron itself on the leading edge. Trailing edge is going to have a little bit more work just because there's a little bit more overhang, but it won't be that bad, as you'll see. So what we want to do is make sure that, and let me grab a piece of scrap foam to set this on. So again, we just want to push. This is the 60 grit sandpaper. It's extremely coarse. It will scratch the top of our surface here, so be careful that you don't lean back and cut into the balsa. And all I'm doing with a 60 grit is just taking off most of this top edge here, and I'm pushing in that direction. Again, be careful that you don't lean down enough that you can scratch your surface, and stop before you get all the way down. We'll do the rest of it with the finer sandpaper. I always find it amazing how quickly this coarse sandpaper takes that balsa down. Alright, that looks good. And I have sanded it just about even. I can just barely feel a little bit sticking up. Again, the most important thing is don't lean too far back that you scratch the balsa surface there. If you do, it's not the end of the world. You know, it's just a matter of aesthetics at that point. So go back and feel, see if you have any high spots sitting up that you feel comfortable using the coarse grit with. If you feel like you're getting a little bit close, change to the 100 grit, and you can run flat and you won't hurt this top surface here. Okay, so I've used some blue tape just to temporarily tape the aileron on top of the wing or on the trailing edge of the wing. And what we need to do now is decide exactly in our little area of possibility here where we want to put that Robart style hinge. Obviously we have our marks here where our little blocks are inside, embedded inside that the foam core there, and here are our marks on the actual wing. I have no idea where I erred right here, and that one got a little bit off, but I still have about an inch of possibility there that they both overlap, and all of these appear to be exactly right. So well, this one's off just a little bit too, so who knows. I think I probably trimmed one end a little further than I should have, thinking it was the root side, and it wasn't. So anyway, it doesn't matter because we still have plenty of overlap. We could probably fit 2 or 3 hinges in that little area if we wanted to. So a couple of things to consider when we're trying to figure out exactly where we're going to put this hinge there. And probably the first is going to be exactly where that arm is going to look for something straight. Where the arm for the servo is going to run the linkage. So if we imagine that servo sitting right there, and at full deflection, which is going to bring it back around to about there, we want those to be straight in line. In other words, we want this to be perpendicular with the wing, so that'll give us our best leverage, in other words. So if you can imagine that arm swinging, it kind of moves this like that, right? Or actually this will pivot, so it does this. And at full deflection, either one way or the other, we want it to be running just about straight up and down, or perpendicular with the wing there. So imagine that arm coming about that far, and So right in there is where we are going to put that perpendicular. Right in there is about where we're going to put that control horn, okay? Again, it doesn't have to be exact. It's just that's about where we're going to put it. And we want to mark that pretty good so that we know not to put our hinge on top of that. So that leaves all of this area here that we can put that hinge. So let's go ahead and decide to put the hinge about right there. And the reason I have these taped together is, one, so that I can look and sit here and think about it for a couple of minutes, and two, so that when I put a tiny, real sharp mark right there with my extra fine Sharpie, it's marking both surfaces at one time, and I know that my holes are going to line up later on. So that's a good area there, right smack in the middle of that one. And then we've got plenty of room here to stick this one. All right, now we can pull that back off. And the next thing we need to do is, now that we know where they're going to be lined up long ways on the wing, we need to make sure that we get those hinges not necessarily centered. It would be nice to have them exactly in the center of the cord there, the wing, or the trailing edge, but we want to make darn sure we get them all in the same alignment, if that makes sense. In other words, we don't want one sitting a little bit forward of this one that way, because what that does is that makes the aileron want to bend when we deflect it. They'll all go on, and it will seem nice, and it may even move, but it'll have a little bit of resistance there. And if they're not all lined up exactly right, what it's doing is pulling these that way, if that makes sense. And eventually you will overstress your the hinge, the actual pivot part of the Robart style hinge. If you've ever seen a Robart hinge that just has a whole lot of slop in it, at first it will scare you and make you think that it has come loose in the balsa, but actually it hasn't, or in most cases it hasn't. What it's done is it has worn the shaft out in there, and the most often or the most prevalent cause for that is because these hinges are not in alignment, and it's putting a lot of bind on that little metal pin in there. So the way to make sure that we're getting all those aligned is you can use just a straight edge of some sort. I happen to have a pretty good straight edge, but you could use a long level or a piece of aluminum angler or whatever you want to use that is perfectly straight. And I just set it up here on top of our surface. Remember, we took the sanding block and sanded sharp a nice sharp flat edge, which is probably 1/8 of an inch wide. I'll try to get some still photos showing down the top of that. So we're 45 degrees coming up, and then I sanded across the top about 1/8 of an inch, and that's where the two of these will actually mate up. So what I'm doing is setting that straight edge up there, so I have put me a tiny little mark at the end of this one in what looks like in the center, and I have put a tiny little mark at the end of this end, which is in the center. And then I'll take my straight edge, align those two marks up, set it on top of that flat, and that looks pretty good. And oops, I bumped it with my finger. And now I'll just put a little line here. Okay. And that is a perfectly flat plane going down through there. And as long as I drill my holes for my servos right in line on that line and line them up this way with our little dots and our little X-Acto cuts there, my hinges are going to be perfectly aligned. And let me grab a wing and show you. Okay, so here is a wing that obviously I haven't covered yet, and the hinges are not glued in, obviously. See, they're just the holes are drilled, and I haven't even trimmed these ailerons yet. But when I push them down nice and tight, you can see how easy this hinge flops back and forth, full deflection. It should just flop. If you get any resistance at all, that means that your hinges are more than likely out of alignment this way. It's kind of easy to get the alignment this way, get this hole lined up with that hole. That's pretty easy to do. A little bit harder trick to do is to get them lined up that way, but I have found that if you do this, you will come out exactly right, and your hinges will not have any resistance on them at all, if that makes sense. Okay, so we've got the wing over at the drill press, and all I've done is affixed a table to the top of the drill press. I like to use the drill press only because I can ensure that it will drill a perfectly perpendicular hole both this way and that way. I have drilled many of them by hand with a hand drill. There's nothing wrong with that. You just have to be careful and go a little bit slower and make sure that you get it perfectly perpendicular. That hinge needs to be exactly straight both in the aileron and in the wing. If it's not, you'll get some bind in there and you'll wear those hinges out prematurely. So all I have done is put a table down on top of the drill press table, and I'll show you in just a little bit. There's and it's just scrap MDF. There's nothing special to it. It's just a T, essentially, that will hold our cull or our husk exactly perpendicular to the table and exactly in line with the drill bit there. And then I just swing it back and forth and get lined up exactly right, and I can drill them all just by sliding this back and forth. And not have to worry about being perpendicular. So I am using a much smaller drill bit. I think this one happens to be 7/64. Eventually we will, this will act as a pilot hole. Eventually we will drill that out to 3/16. Again, the logic is aim small, miss small. That way we're punching a small hole through that balsa before we go with a big drill bit, which could find softer areas in the balsa, which will help that bit wander from side to side. So if we run a pilot hole first, we're much more likely to drill a perfectly straight hole. So nothing to it. Get lined up. That looks good. Again, it's going through this triangle stock, through our 1/2-inch block, and then you'll actually feel it when it gets to the bottom of that 1/2-inch glue or the 1/2-inch block. You'll feel it go through the glue before it loosens up going into the foam. There we go. Let me grab a hinge and we'll test fit that right quick. Yeah, that's plenty deep enough. I have taken the little backer board off of here. It just screws on with a decking screw. That's what helps hold the entire wing up there, right? The caul of the wing, because it's a whole lot taller, and I need additional support on the backside rather than this short one. So for the aileron, though, we are perfectly happy with a real short fence on the backside, and because the short fence is a lot more accurate, we don't have to be as sensitive with, in other words, we don't have to put a fine line going this way on top of the aileron, because this nice big fat piece of foam right here fits up nice and tight against the back of the fence. And as long as we get one of these in the center, all of the rest of them obviously are going to follow in the center as well, because we have a nice tight fit there. See, I can't squeeze any of that. On the tall fence, if I pushed, I could be able to push some of that over and get out of adjustment, so I don't trust that, if that makes sense. But this is very tight and rigid, so they're all going to be in perfect alignment as long as I hold it up tight. If that makes sense. It will in just a minute if it doesn't now. So we're going to drill our 7/32 pilot hole to start with. Hold it up tight. All right, let me grab some hinges and we'll move on to the next step. Okay, so we've got all of our holes drilled, and they should be perfectly aligned. I guess this is the moment of truth. We'll stick some hinges in, run them all the way down. They will go down just a little bit further here in just a couple of minutes, so that's not a big deal. That's the root end. So we'll see just how good we did. All right, that looks pretty good. Wow, that is nice. Okay, so if we look though, we can see that these hinges will not go all the way down. There's a little bit of a gap, and despite the fact that we push them as hard as we can, with a 3/16 hole, we're not going to be able to get those to go all the way down. And we can see what I'm talking about. So we've got some gap there, even though that hinge is all the way down in as far as it can go there. We just can't get rid of that gap. So what we're going to do is cut a small V or notch at the top of that mating surface there to allow that hinge to sit further down inside. What we want is for the hinge, the pin of this hinge, to sit just at the top of our little V in our triangle stock there. So we want to split that hinge pin right on the top of the peak of that V. So to do that, we're going to have to push that hinge down in just a little bit further. And I don't know if you can see it there. So we can actually wiggle it and get it to wiggle down, wallow down a little bit to get exactly center. And that's great, but it only allows that hinge to go so far before the knuckle of the hinge, or the arm right there at the knuckle, starts to bind on the top of our balsa here. So one way to get around that, or to mitigate that, is to cut us out just a small V in the balsa with a super sharp X-Acto knife. Just like that. Now, if we notice, our hinge goes down nice, and we're splitting that pin exactly on top of our V there, the top of our peak, and look how much further over that hinge can go now. So we can get maximum deflection because we've taken out this meat here to allow that to happen. So we're going to do that on every one of these. There we go. And don't cut it too big. You still, you don't want to get rid of all your glue surface area. But we're not cutting into the area right now. If you do it right, you're not cutting into the area that is going to have glue anyway, because we don't want any epoxy around or on the knuckle of our hinge, if that makes sense there. So, and when we get to that part later on, after we cover this with covering in a much later episode, I'll show you how I put these hinges in with epoxy. And we'll go to great lengths to keep that knuckle very, very clean. But at this point, in our preparation point here, we want to make sure that we get at least 90 degrees deflection there, and that one's doing perfectly. Let's check this one. Oh yeah, that looks really nice. All right, now we'll try it again. And that goes all the way down and gets rid of every bit of our hinge gap. And if you can see, we have absolutely no hinge gap at all. So we are perfect. I really like that. Okay, so I really like the way that this wing and aileron setup have worked out. We have absolutely no resistance at all. And we have gotten rid of every bit of hinge gap that we could possibly have. I may end up trimming this back just a little bit. That's why I haven't put the cap on it yet. I need to round up my incidence meter, and what dictates how far on the root side I trim this back. Of course, on the tip side, it comes flush to the edge. But what dictates how far back I bring this, because it's not that critical. We could come back probably 2 inches if we wanted to. But I want to give just enough room. I want as much aileron as I could get on the inboard side. That'll help me with high alpha maneuvers, hovering and Harrier and that sort of stuff, because the prop wash is running very close to the fuselage, right? I don't want to be dependent on ailerons way out here. I want to get as much control as I can right next to the fuselage, right? So I want to take advantage of as long as aileron as I can get coming up to the fuselage. But I need room for my incident meter to hang on the back of this. And if I remember, it's about 1 inch wide, maybe 1.25 inches. I'm not exactly sure. I'm going to have to round that up. So I may have to trim this back another 1/4 inch or so. That way, when I'm setting the incidence on this wing, and we'll do that a couple of episodes down the road, you'll see how that gauge fits over the trailing edge of the wing and over the leading edge of the wing, and that helps me get the tilt or the incidence of that wing exactly right. So that's the only reason that I have this still open now. And it's pretty easy to put that cap on once I find my incident meter sitting around here somewhere. I'm sure it's staring at me, laughing at me. But anyway, this is a good spot to, obviously, a good spot to end this episode. And I hope that you picked up some tips. If you did, hit the like button. Don't forget to subscribe. That's very important. The subscribe button is the most important. So please hit that subscribe button and like, and I will see you in the next video.